Welcome to 40 Winks Café. And I mean, I can't even say, I hope you slept well, because some of you haven't, so I won't be saying that. But it's great to see so many of you here. My name is Diletta, and I'm the organizer of the cafe. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce the Being Human Festival and the research project behind the cafe, and then we'll get started. As you may know, this event is part of this year's Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which is taking place across the UK between the 12th and the 22nd of November 2020. So you still have a few days to catch on some events. And I can say that I've been to a few of them and they've been all very nice. So Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities. It is run by the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Events are mostly online this year, and I'm sure you can imagine why. And you can see the full program of events on the festival's website, which is beinghumanfestival.org. You can also find the festival on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as Being Human Fest. And the hashtag for this year is Being Human 2020. So if you'd like to post about tonight's event, feel free to use that hashtag. We also have a specific cafe's hashtag, which is 40 Winks Café. So at the end of the cafe, we'll be circulating a link to a Being Human Festival feedback survey. And I'll also email this to you via Eventbrite. So please take a moment to fill in this feedback survey. It's very short. And it will help the festival to keep as many events as free as possible in future years. And of course, your feedback will also help improve events like these. So this cafe is brought to you by a new research project, which is based at Northumbria University in the Humanities Department, and is funded by the Wellcome Trust. And also involves collaboration with the Northumbria Centre for Sleep Research. So tonight you'll hear from people from both the Humanities and the Northumbria Centre for Sleep Research. So Writing the Sleep Crisis seeks to explore how sleep is represented in contemporary culture. So the project focuses on the idea of a sleep crisis. So in other words, the idea that when we talk about sleep in contemporary society, and I think that the chat was a good indication of that, we often talk about how much we're not sleeping effectively. So in my work on this project, I analyzed this idea of the sleep crisis across a variety of texts, from fiction to non-fiction, so memoirs, essays, self-help, and digital culture. And I'm interested in thinking about what these writings tell us about our understandings of sleep, what these writings tell us about health, specifically mental health, but also what these writings tell us about our day-to-day lives and how it feels to be living in the contemporary moment, which obviously has some impact on sleep as well. So you can follow the project on Twitter and Facebook if you'd like. We hope to be having a lot more of public events, so that's a good way to keep up to date with future events and initiatives. A website is also coming soon, and we're recording tonight's event, so it will be up on the website as soon as possible. Okay, so before I hand over to Claire, who's going to be chairing tonight's event, I just wanted to say a few thank yous. So thank you for Being Human Festival for providing a space for this event. Thank you to New Writing North, who have helped with the organization of the event. So Claire specifically, who I'll introduce in a moment, and she'll be chairing, as I said, tonight's event, but also Grace Keane, who's working behind the scenes. So she's keeping an eye on the chat. So if you've got any questions to our speakers at any point, just pop it in the chat and we'll come to it in the Q&A session. And also, obviously, thank you to Katy Shaw and Jason Ellis, who are both speaking tonight and who have been incredibly supportive of the project. So thank you. And finally, of course, thanks to all of you for being here, and especially to those of you who submitted recommendations of books about sleep, films about sleep, videos, podcasts, apps. I'm putting together a list of these suggestions, and I'll be sending it out to you as soon as possible, so keep an eye out for that. So without further ado, Claire Malcolm of New Writing North, as she is the CEO of New Writing North, which is one of Northumbria University's cultural partners. And New Writing North is an agency that supports writing and reading in the north of England. So we're incredibly lucky to have Claire with us chairing the event tonight. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Diletta. Welcome everyone to the official start of the 40 Winks Café. I was fascinated when I was asked to get involved with this event because of course sleep is something that affects us all. We all have it or want more of it or wish it was better. Tonight we are going to explore representations of sleep, our sleep health and sleep illnesses and how they manifest in our contemporary culture. Sleep is one aspect of our lives that unites us as an experience. But of course, as with many things, we all experience sleep differently, and we can never really know how everyone else experiences their sleep. I feel that sleep has raised its game in our consciousness this year, as a lack of it or a disturbed experience of it has been one of the many responses to the pandemic, which many of us have experienced. Insomnia stalks many writers that I know and many people that I know, and for many different reasons, a lack of sleep can have many negative outcomes for us in terms of health and day-to-day life. Sleep also presents myriad areas of interest for creative writers and artists, and representations of sleep permeate our literary history and culture. It's a fascinating area. To help us explore it tonight, I'm delighted to welcome 3 speakers from Northumbria University. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will then speak. Diletta de Cristofaro, who you've just heard from tonight, is a research fellow and author of the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel, which was published by Bloomsbury earlier this year. She writes about contemporary culture, crises, and the politics of time. Katy is Professor of 21st Century Writings and Director of Cultural Partnerships at the university. Her research interests include contemporary literature, medical humanities, and creative diversity. Professor Jason Ellis is a Professor of Sleep Science and Director of the Northumbria Sleep Research Laboratory. He is a qualified somnologist and a practicing psychologist. His basic research interests include the pathophysiology, have I said that right, Jason? Pathophysiology, we'll maybe come back to that, of sleep disorders and applied work on cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia, which I'd never heard of and was really interested to hear of. He has consulted for various industries and third sector organisations and provided national guidelines to the British and Scottish governments on the identification and management of sleep problems. So each of these fantastic, interesting people has presented a presentation or a speech about their area of interest in relation to sleep. So I'm going to hand over to Diletta and we'll hear from each of them and then I'm going to ask them some questions. But meanwhile, if you have thoughts, comments and questions, put them in the chat and I will then come back to them when we've heard all of the presentations and we'll weave in your questions as well. So Diletta, tell us about sleep.
Just sharing my screen again. Oops. Sorry. Okay. Right. So hi again. My talk tonight pays homage to the theme of this year's Being Human Festival, which is New Worlds. So I will explore with you how science fiction and speculative fiction, so genres of literature that are very much defined by the conjuring up of new worlds, imagine the futures of sleep, so as to reflect on the conceptions of sleep that underlie our present. So I'm sure that in this pandemic year, these images might look somewhat familiar to you. Obviously, there's a giant jellyfish up there on the right, which might throw you off a bit. But other than that, you know, the slogan, protect yourself and others, maps detailing outbreaks, quarantine zones. These are now sadly part of our daily reality. Way before coronavirus, dystopian epidemics of imagined sleep disorders, so mostly it's extreme insomnia, but in some cases also extreme sleep from which people actually can't wake up, are the most common way in which speculative and science fiction writers imagine new worlds of sleep. So the pictures on the slide come from a 2014 novella called Sleep Donation by American author Karen Russell. It was originally published in a digital-only format, but it's now out in paperback this year with these illustrations that you see on the slide. So Sleep Donation imagines a very near future world. There isn't much difference between our present and what Russell imagines, except of course for an epidemic of total sleep loss called terminal insomnia, which leaves thousands of people incapable of sleeping for weeks until obviously they die from this constant hypervigilance. So typical medications that we now use to treat insomnia don't work on this disease, on this disorder. And the only way people affected by terminal insomnia can be saved is through a sleep donation. So the good news is that one sleep transfusion is generally enough for these patients' circadian rhythms to reset. And so they start sleeping normally again. But the waiting lists for these transfusions are incredibly long because, of course, there aren't enough donors. And what's more, sleep donations are at risk of being compromised by incredibly contagious nightmares. So the jellyfish that you saw on the previous slide is an outbreak, basically, of a contagious nightmare. And these outbreaks actually lead to another type of insomnia, which is called elective insomnia, in which basically people decide not to sleep. They try to stay awake at all costs because they don't want to fall asleep, given that they will then have these horrible nightmares. So obviously, this kind of scenario isn't particularly likely from a scientific point of view. I'm sure that Jason probably, as a sleep psychologist in the room, will feel that this is a bit ridiculous and is probably right. But it's interesting to think about what's going on here in terms of the kind of relationships that we can trace between this near future and our own world. So arguably what Russell is doing, she's taking to the extreme consequences widespread concerns around the poor quality of sleep in contemporary society. So concerns that are highlighted by headlines like these on the slide. So headlines that speak of a crisis of poor sleep, which becomes a public health crisis. And this kind of discourse, so this idea of a sleep crisis, this idea of poor sleep becoming essentially a public health emergency, has been given new impetus, of course, as Claire was saying, by the coronavirus crisis, because of course many people, and you might have experienced this yourself, are struggling with sleep now more than ever. So sleep donation epidemic of terminal insomnia really serves to magnify these kind of concerns around our contemporary society lack of sleep. So this relationship between Russell's imagined near future and our world, our present, is evident from the initial reactions to this epidemic. So people initially dismiss terminal insomnia as an exaggeration of a universal contemporary condition. Nobody has enough sleep in this society that, again, closely resembles our own. And what's interesting is that once it becomes clear that this insomnia epidemic is not a mere exaggeration, the world imagined by Russell doesn't actually try to address the kind of root causes of this disease. And these root causes are the same ones that are often kind of speculated to be behind the perceived crisis of sleep in contemporary society. So things like, 24/7 society, for instance, an economic system, things like digital media, technologies that kind of blur the boundaries between work time and free time, so it becomes impossible to switch off. A society that is obsessed with productivity, with outputting. So nothing is really done about these kind of root causes, but rather the world imagined by Russell descends into essentially a very dystopian situation in which sleep becomes just another commodity. And an incredibly precious one at that, which actually opens up new and disturbing avenues for exploitation and profiteering. And I'm not going to spoil the book for you, so I'm just going to leave it there, but do read the book if you're interested. And there's a consistent trend of fictions that, like sleep donation, revolve around these kind of epidemics or pandemics in some cases of insomnia. So you've got a few examples on the slide if you're interested in finding out more about this trend. You've got a thriller, for instance, like Charlie Houston's Sleepless, but also a young adult dystopia like Cherie Dimalin's The Marrow Thieves. But obviously, pandemics of extreme insomnia aren't the only way in which authors of science and speculative fiction have imagined these new worlds of sleep. So here's a kind of different example. Nancy Kress' Sleepless trilogy, which is was published between 1991 and 1996, and which conjures up a world in which some human beings are genetically modified so as not to need any sleep at all. So here's perhaps a question for you, right? So if you could be genetically modified to need no sleep at all without any kind of detriment to your health, would you do it? And if so, why? So again, as with sleep donation, this isn't a particularly likely scenario, but again, let's consider the kind of echoes that there are between this future world and our own world. So these on the slides, are the words that the father of one of the first children who are genetically modified to be sleepless uses to justify his decision to genetically engineer his daughter. So he says, "Do you know how much more I could have accomplished if I hadn't had to sleep all my life?" So sleep to him is just lost time, wasted life. So something that stands in the way of accomplishments, of productivity. So this father, and by extension, obviously, the society that comes up with this plan to genetically engineer this sleepless future, embodies the harmful but also quite pervasive view that to be successful, one has to sleep as little as possible, that to sleep is a kind of indulgence, a kind of guilty pleasure. So this isn't a particularly new view. If you go back to Thomas Edison, for instance, the American inventor, he was renowned for saying that claiming that he only slept 4 to 5 hours per night, and for viewing sleep as a kind of waste of time and loss of opportunities. I'm sure you could come up with several other examples of historical figures, more or less historical figures that propound this kind of worldview. For instance, this is a more contemporary example. It's Elon Musk, Tesla CEO, and his kind of workaholism and extreme sleep deprivation is really a kind of cornerstone of the way in which he actually narrates his success. So Kress is clearly denouncing this kind of damaging worldview because in her trilogy, actually, this kind of genetically modified future in which people don't need any sleep at all isn't exactly desirable. Again, I won't spoil it for you, but the consequences for humanity are quite dire. So to wrap up this kind of very brief tour of new worlds of sleep in contemporary science and speculative fiction, obviously the narratives that I've introduced you to tonight are all dystopian narratives, right? They are narratives that imagine nightmarish futures of sleep to question how we understand sleep in our society. But of course, the purpose of dystopian narratives is also to encourage us to think differently, right? To think of alternatives, of more hopeful futures, to imagine ideal, so utopian worlds rather than dystopian. And so I want to leave you with these questions that perhaps we could go back to later on in our conversation. So if you could change the way we sleep, or perhaps the context in which we sleep, what would you do? What type of new worlds of sleep do you dream of? And obviously this is an incredibly lame pun, but you know, I'll just leave it there. So thank you.
Thanks, Diletta. I'm sure we're going to come back to that because I had a note about Elon Musk as well that I was going to bring up this evening. Next up is Katy Shaw. Welcome, Katy.
Hi, Claire. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Well, I'm going to kind of take on the baton from Diletta and carrying it over even more into the 21st century, because I'm going to be thinking a little bit about tracing the history of sleep in literature generally, and how that has evolved since the year 2000 to move off the page and onto digital platforms. So when we think about sleep generally in literature, we might think about the act of reading and the act of writing, as well as the kind of the whole ecosystem of books and of bookshops and libraries, and the way they play a really important part in our sleep lives and also in our day-to-day lives in society in terms of our health and our well-being as individuals and as a collective. And if we think about it, that kind of real borderline space between rest and wakefulness means that sleep itself could actually end up occupying quite a marginal space in terms of narrative invisibility. But actually, sleep has been a major preoccupation of writers across the ages. And certainly since the year 2000, the presence of sleep has become quite a pervasive subject in contemporary writing. But sleep as a major concern is actually nothing new. You know, if we think back to our very earliest fairy stories, right? The Sleeping Beauty that we were all told about, all the way through to Shakespeare and Midsummer Night's Dream, where we sleep perchance to dream, and all the way through to Dickens in the 19th century with Ebenezer Scrooge and his famous ghosts that deliver incredibly timely, Christmassy moral messages as he dreams. So we have this long literary history of sleep going on, and it permeates particularly the English literary canon. It's kind of this pervasive obsession that's extended in the 21st century, because sleep, as Claire pointed out in her introduction, is a bit of a paradox when it comes to representing it in art. Because while sleep is a universal human experience, it's also one of those rare experiences that we all encounter completely differently. We experience it entirely individually. So the role of sleep in characters' lives in literature can often tell us an awful lot about that individual. And it's often used as a bit of a literary device by writers for us to open up, for us to crack open characters and have a look into their lairs. So their sleep lives can tell us an awful lot about things like their relationships, their self-awareness, their anxiety, quite a lot, how much sleep they're either getting or not getting, and also that sometimes their fetishization with their sleeping environment and then comparing it to their waking world. So one way in which we cope with sleep then is by writing about it and reading about it. And this feeds into the much wider role of literature in terms of promoting and enabling well-being more generally. So this tension between sleep as a shared constant experience and also as a totally individual personal experience really manifests itself in literature to the way we think writers narrativize sleep. So the way they use sleep as a narrative device, a plot device to tell their stories. But through this, writers can politicize sleep, they can aestheticize sleep, and they can medicalize sleep. And that all complicates the way in which we represent this particular experience. And also, as Diletta's pointed out, if we then bring in kind of generic forms, so things like genre fiction in terms of either sci-fi or dystopia, or even erotica and romance, or the gothic monsters that haunt your dreams, these all inject this supposedly safe space of sleep with a little bit of tension and a little bit of drama. Because historically, sleep as an unsafe space or a space that causes us tension or problems has actually been represented through novelists that talk about characters' problems with their sleep. So, you know, some people in the chat at the open there mentioned insomnia, mentioned not getting much sleep, and the impact of this on mental health. And that's something writers have really been interested in interrogating through literature. You know, as Charlotte Bronte reminded us, a ruffled mind makes a restless pillow. And I love that quote, because through writing their literary characters, authors can give us that little bit of critical distance from our sleep, to think about new ways of understanding the way in which losing sleep or compromising sleep can affect the rest of our lives. But sleep as a storytelling device also opens up a whole world of new possibilities. Dreams are a way of resolving situations encountered in our waking lives that are actually very difficult to comprehend otherwise. And as John Steinbeck reminds us, a problem difficult at night is resolved in the morning after the Committee of Sleep has worked on it. And as a narrative act, this act of making sense is what narrative is all about. Narrative is about meaning making. And And dreams enable us to structure these experiences that might seem daunting or random otherwise. And in literature, characters can explore alternate lives in their sleep, reveal inner truths through their dreams, or become inspired to create things in periods of sleeplessness. And today, bedtime stories and literature in bedtime and sleep is not just for children. We've seen in the 21st century the rise of what become known as sleep stories, a form of bedtime tales for grown-ups. And this has recently become a real phenomenon on the Calm app that you can download. And it's long been common for us to go to bed with maybe the radio on or the TV on in the background. But in the new millennium, digital platforms have really grown to rival this space. And we've seen a rise in the number of people using podcasts, audiobooks, and apps to fall asleep. So we're now really comfortable getting our narratives from digital sources. The Calm app itself was developed as a mindfulness and meditation app. But after a few years of operation, the owners realized that they were seeing real peaks in user data going up just before 11 o'clock at night. And that's when they realized that the users were actually turning to the Calm app to help them get to sleep. And so in response to this user demand, Calm developed what they called sleep stories, which is a bank of modern fairy tales for grown-ups. And they feature a real diversity of tales, everything from travelogues to soundscapes, to busy streets, to diaries. But what unites them all is the fact that they're narrated with a very kind of a calm, relaxed way. They all involve some element of transportation to other worlds or other lives or other periods. So they allow us to kind of escape our immediate lives as grown-ups. And some of the narrators aren't bad either. We've got people like Stephen Fry, Matthew McConaughey, and they've downloaded so far over 150 million times. So they must be doing something right. And as a sign of this, Calm have actually employed the first ever sleep writer in residence, a lovely lady called Phoebe Smith, who has become this kind of pioneer of what's being called slow literature. Now, as a writer, for all the writers in our chat tonight, you know it's not always a good thing if people tell you your stories send them to sleep. But this is precisely the purpose of these sleep stories. They aim to offer these escape, sensory journeys, getting us away from our adult lives and into the relaxing world of sleep. And as well as being good for sleep, these stories have the added benefit of helping us engage with literature and storytelling again as grown-ups. Because one thing I hear, and you probably hear all too often, is we don't have the time to read in our busy lives. So sleep stories are encouraging us to engage with narrative in a period when things like audiobooks and podcasts are on the rise. So if we're thinking about Calm and sleep stories also tapping into this modern zeitgeist, it's really important because they're the very conditions that predated the pandemic that have actually been exacerbated by lockdown, and they've done extra well as a result of this period. But what the pandemic has also taught us is that people rely on literature to sleep, and that can also mean physical books. Lockdown life has severely impacted our own ability to travel, but reading a good book can get you much further than any travel agent. By immersing ourselves in a really good read, we can tackle the isolation that's been brought about by COVID-19 containment, but we can also transport ourselves away from the immediate traumas of the everyday world. And it's no coincidence that when bookshops began to reopen with the high street, they saw some of the highest footfall and highest sales when we unlocked a few months ago. And in Japan, it's quite common for people to go off into the forest to find space and relaxation. But we're seeing that post-lockdown, us Brits actually prefer book bathing, where we go into bookshops to find our space and our Zen time. And I think that's really important because what we've seen, and I know we've seen many things in the wake of the pandemic, and it's made us wake up to many different issues, but one of which is the importance of local bookshops, the importance of libraries, and the importance of groups like reading groups and library groups in bringing people together, in improving connectivity, improving well-being, and also improving sleep as a result of that. Loneliness is a form of lockdown that predates the pandemic. By offering a vital social function, literature, bookshops, libraries can help connect and embed dialogue and experience and enhance our well-being and also our sleep. So why is literature so important when it comes to sleep in the 21st century when we've got so many other competing things to watch and listen to? Well, literature brings together in a very unique way, I would argue, key platforms, key methodologies, and also opportunities for navigating the stresses of the present through a structured means of making sense of our experience. By representing sleep and the lives of characters, by offering us tales to help us engage in sleep ourselves, and helping distract us from whatever's going on in front of us. Writing, reading, this whole ecosystem of libraries and bookshops encourages balance. It encourages anchoring and connectivity, especially in lockdown life. And literature, as a result, is something that we should protect and also sleep on, now and in the dark months ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Katy. I was drifting off there thinking about sleepovers in libraries and bookshops. I think that's maybe something we should start thinking about. Right, next up is Jason, and I guess we're going to get some factual, real information about sleep from the real world now. So please welcome Jason.
Hello there. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Oh, I'm not allowed. Oh no.
It should work now.
Let's try it. Let's have a look. Can everyone see me? It's like being at a seance, isn't it? Can anyone hear me? All right, so what am I going to talk about? You know, we've had some dystopia ideas about sleep, which I think Diletta pointed out are not really going to be scientifically based. And then Katy's talked really beautifully about how we embed sleep into literature, and certainly she's got me going off to a bookshop tomorrow. What am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about sleep in the pandemic, and I'm just going to give you a broad overview of it, and then we're going to talk about some ways in which we could improve our sleep and some of the things that are actually a bit detrimental to our sleep at the moment. But believe it or not, the pandemic has done one thing. We've actually increased the amount of sleep we're getting. All of the studies that are coming out now, especially from China and Italy, are demonstrating that we're getting more sleep than we were pre-pandemic. The problem is the quality of that sleep is severely diminished. If we look at some data from China, about 7,000 people, they're demonstrating that 18% of the population are now suffering from what we would classify as a severe type of insomnia. That's not even just the odd, horrible night of sleep. This is quite a severe 5 nights a week. Italy, same sort of thing here. What we're seeing is in their sample of over 2,000 people, almost 60% of people are suffering from a moderate form of insomnia. So we're getting more sleep in the pandemic. The challenge is we're not sleeping terribly well when we do it. What's the main cause? Of course, it's anxiety. There's a lot of issues that are going on at the moment. People are drinking more. I certainly know I am. And one of the outcomes of that, of course, is that it's very detrimental to sleep. It's a great way to get off to sleep, but the sleep you get is very, very poor quality. But anxiety seems to be fueling this development of sleep problems. If we look further into the data from Italy, what are the main predictors? So what is it that's really predicting this level of poor sleep at the moment? Being younger, believe it or not, we all often talk about older adults as having poorer sleep. But one of the things that we also know is that they're more tolerant to getting less sleep. And so at the moment, being younger is actually a risk for developing much more poor sleep and insomnia. Being female. And the rest of it is really about that anxiety, fear about contact or contracting the disease, and of course, uncertainties as to whether you have the infection or you don't. So we've got the anxiety, we've got the stress, those things are really going into developing this poor sleep. There's a couple of other things really because of the lockdown. One of them is that we've changed the way that we're working. We sometimes are working in our bedrooms. I'm very lucky, I don't have to work in my bedroom, but a lot of people are now working in their bedroom. And that's going to blur the lines between a sleep environment and a work environment. And so somehow we've got to try to renegotiate that space. And our routines have changed as well. Many of us are not going out as often, so we're not getting access to light. And bright light, natural light, is one of the best ways to reset the body clock and get you ready for sleep later on that night. And of course, we're probably not exercising as much as well. And exercise is beautiful in terms of getting deep, refreshing sleep, especially the sleep that we need to fight off infection and keep us healthy and growing. So what can we do about it? What are my top tips? Haha. Top tips, the 3 do's and the 3 don'ts, because I was only allowed 10 minutes. Right, what about our 3 do's? Let's try and deal with some of this anxiety. Putting the day to bed before you go to bed. And what we're talking about here is what I like to call constructive worry time. About 2 hours before bedtime, sit down with a pad and a pen, write down everything that you've done today, everything you've got to do tomorrow, and everything that you've put in place to help you deal with tomorrow. What we're doing here is we're trying to clear out the mind, and we're trying to leave you in more control. One of the biggest issues that we see is when people can't sleep. What do they think about? What did I muck up today? I was just about to say a very rude word. What did I muck up today? What am I going to muck up tomorrow? And how absolutely unprepared I am for tomorrow. By writing these things down, you can clear that out of the mind. Try to keep a regular sleep-wake pattern. Now, of the 2, actually waking up at the same time is better than going to bed at the same time. And that's because your body clock, the thing that regulates the timing of your sleep, and your drive to sleep, they tend to be in tandem in the morning. So if there was one recommendation about your timing of sleep, try to keep a regular waking up time. You can play a little bit around with your going to bedtime, but waking up is hard to do. What happens if you are in bed and you can't sleep? Get out of bed. The challenge is, it's nice, isn't it? You're in bed, all right, it's not great because you're not sleeping, but there's this tendency to think, oh, you know, I'll just relax. The problem with relaxing in bed is we do something called micro-sleeping. We drift in and out of sleep. Now, that might sound lovely. And it is to a certain degree. The problem is that all of the deep, refreshing sleep that we need, we don't get that whilst we're micro-sleeping, but it takes away the drive to sleep. So if you can't sleep, get out of bed, go and do something completely meaningless. I play with Lego. What about the don'ts? What are you not allowed to do according to me? Don't try to sleep. Anyone who's ever tried to sleep has found that the opposite happens. You're more likely to be lying there, getting tense, frustrated, and miserable. And the last thing we need is people being frustrated in bed. It's not going to help you get off to sleep at night, is it? So don't try it. In fact, if you're not sleeping, stay awake for a little bit longer. It will actually reduce your tension quite a lot and help you ease off to sleep. One bad night does not an insomnia of dystopian proportion make. You know, we are very, very conscious, and I think this speaks to what Diletta and Katy have talked about so far. We're becoming very conscious about our sleep. And there is this automatic tendency that I will compensate. If I didn't get enough, I'll compensate. It's not a great plan. What we know is the body corrects itself. If you leave it alone, it will correct itself. And finally, and this is my favorite, don't over-monitor. What we're seeing in today's society is there is a tendency to monitor sleep within the nth degree. And I'm actually seeing patients these days, and they will come to me with their devices and they'll say, oh, I'm dying. And I'll say, well, take it off and you'll live. We've become very, very conscious about sleep, and I think that's a beautiful thing. But over monitoring it actually can disrupt it. So keep an eye on it, but don't over contextualize it. All of these tips are actually available. There's a beautiful self-help pamphlet which I have created, which if anyone ever needs it or wants it, it is free and it is available. So do feel free to get in touch. Always just like to say thank you to everyone who does all of the work, and I just float around the world talking about it, or I used to float around the world talking about it. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jason. We just had a question in the chat, which I'm just going to ask you, which is, can you explain what PSQI means?
Yes.
What that acronym means?
Yeah, it's called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. So it's a measure. It's got 19 items, which gives us an indication of somebody's sleep quality. And we usually say 5 and above is moderate insomnia. If you're going over 7, it's more severe insomnia.
Okay. Generally, how many people have really good sleep? Is that the biggest proportion of people?
Oh, you ask a really awkward question.
Just so we can all think about where we are on that continuum.
Right. I'll let you into a wee discussion I've been having this afternoon with so I'm doing some work at the moment for Public Health England, and they're looking to create the guidelines on sleep. And one of the problems that we were discussing today is that there is actually no normal sleep. There's no definition. So we can say that a certain proportion of people are sleeping between adults, between 7 and 9 hours. And that is what we would see as a recommended amount for adults. The challenge is we're starting to see that there are populations of people that sleep 4.5 hours, and they show no health consequences whatsoever. So the question is still open, and I think it's open from a literary perspective just as much as a scientific one.
How interesting, how interesting. Right, I've got some questions for you all. I'd like to start with Diletta. I'm interested in, the fact that you are focusing on post-apocalyptic novels. And obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. And I would suspect that we're all losing quite a lot of sleep around lots of those things. Why did you choose to look at sleep in the genre of post-apocalyptic novels? Is it because it's very prevalent, or did you have a different interest that drove you to look at that?
Well, I mean, at the time in which this project was born, I was sleeping very, very badly, basically. And I was finishing my book on post-apocalyptic fiction, and I started seeing everywhere kind of headlines about this idea of a sleep crisis. And so because in general, I'm interested in the idea of crisis and how, again, like contemporary culture is so obsessed with crisis on so many different levels, I put together the two. But it's very interesting that you were mentioning the idea of the climate crisis, because one thing that really strikes me as interesting in the text that I was talking about, that there is a constant kind of environmental theme going on. So, for instance, in Sleep Donation, which is the first novel that I was talking about, this idea of sleep donation or sleep transfusions, right? The author kind of draws parallels between the mining of sleep from these subjects and the mining of resources from the earth. So there's a constant kind of parallel going on between kind of like, extraction of sleep and extraction of resources. And more broadly, in all these kind of texts that I'm looking at, one of the kind of hypotheses that scientists at any point in these narratives make is that essentially the climate crisis might actually be a kind of cause for the sleep, the crisis of sleep in these novels, which is obviously fictional again, because it's all about these kind of like extreme epidemics of insomnia. But it is obvious that these writers are thinking about how the climate, of course, the climate crisis, of course, impacts our mental health, effectively, our sense of being in the world, and how this in turn, of course, impacts our sleep.
Yes, because I was thinking, and I decided not to pose my question this way, but, you know, we're doing quite a lot of work around climate at New Writing North, and some people would say we are already kind of in the apocalypse moment, you know. And I was thinking, obviously the pandemic has made us look at and research kind of sleep habits, but I wonder if even going into the pandemic, the kind of existential threats that seem to be around us in a very big way, whether or not we were in a sleep disturbance or crisis kind of anyway, you know, and that's a psychological reaction we're seeing from people to these bigger questions. Yeah, so that was interesting. Do you think, what does the representation of sleep in these novels that you're looking at tell us about ourselves?
I think it tells us a lot about how we understand the self in contemporary society. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is how the way in which we understand our role in the world then obviously impacts the way we sleep. So one of the kind of themes that the project looks at is the idea of work, right? And so the distinction, for instance, between work time and free time. And how this, of course, again, this kind of blurring of the distinction. And of course, Jason was talking about how during the coronavirus emergency, of course, there is a lot more of this kind of blurring of the lines because a lot of us are working in the same room in which we sleep. But in many ways, that kind of blurring of the lines was already there before, right? It's one of the reasons why people often complain of a poor night sleep, effectively. So I'm very interested in how, you know, the kind of imperatives that we construct around us because of work. So say, you know, that we have to be productive, for instance, or, you know, that we have to, you know, always say yes, for instance, to things might in turn impact our sleep. So the kind of culture of work that we live in, which is a very kind of over-performing, over-achiever culture, then in turn tells us something about ourselves and the way we sleep, of course.
Very interesting. I mean, I am fascinated by these ideas that seem to be around about, I suppose, the value of sleep, but the value of sleep for us as individuals, or the idea of how much negotiation you can have with yourself about how you sleep, this performing kind of angle on it. Because I think that's really embedded in the culture of work, especially at kind of executive work or entrepreneurial level. You know, I was Googling it this afternoon, and you Google for 2 seconds and it's Elon Musk, it's Bill Gates, it's Margaret Thatcher, all these people who claim to not need sleep and to be able to work multiple 24-hour days without sleeping. You know, my observation would be, well, I think you might be able to tell sometimes that you may have been a little in bed. But it's there, isn't it? It's part of how we think about ourselves. And I was fascinated by those books you talked about if you could choose not to sleep, would you? And the chat room lit up a little bit then. Because it seems that we do like sleep, we do know the value of it, even if we didn't need to have it. Most of us don't want to be performing 24 hours a day, do we? Kind of, and that doesn't seem to be what the future might be shaping up as. Very interesting. Katy, I've got some questions for you as well. Somebody in the chat mentioned that just before you talked about dreams, that we weren't talking about dreams. And I wanted to ask you about kind of narrative structures and approaches to narrative and storytelling that you see in contemporary literature, and how the idea of dreamscapes or fragmentation, the kind of stuff we experience maybe around sleep, is impacting or shaping contemporary literature. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I was thinking about novels like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas and things where probably the nearest thing you could hang that approach on would be the feeling of coming in and out of dreams and the kind of random connections that happen.
It's really interesting, right, in terms of it being a kind of narrative device and a storytelling device, because if you're a writer and you have this whole, I mean, I guess it's like the Jekyll and Hyde thing, right? You've got this whole other world of a character that you want to expose somehow and you want to really dig into. The dream state is a perfect alternative world to do that in terms of character development. but also in terms of a narrative device, it gives this ability to shift in and out, to offer different layers, to offer different realities to the narrative as well, and offer it real depth. And I think it's no coincidence, as you know, Diletta's research will show, that we have this real weight of texts about sleep in the 21st century, partly because of the reasons that you've just articulated, to do with kind of obsession with sleep, and that almost like when you were at school and, you know, everybody was revising harder and doing more work than you were around exam time. You know, this competitive sleeping seems to be a real thing today, that everyone is getting more sleep, better sleep, can measure it better than you, or equally is getting worse sleep, far worse, far less than you. So, you know, I don't have kids, but my friends with kids seem to have competitively less sleep competitions, and those without seem to have competitively more. And we're seeing that reflected in narrative, because, you know, when we get back to it, storytelling, whether it's about dreams or whether it's about reality, narrative is about making meaning. And at a time when we also have this lack of narrative security around comms, to do with the pandemic, to do with COVID, where people don't feel sure about the stories they're being told, or indeed how it will end. And don't forget, one of the really refreshing things about dreams in literature is about waking up again. It's about that resolution. And I think we can map this kind of popularity about dreams and sleep in literature also onto things like the rise in crime fiction sales in the pandemic. You know, people are really hungry for a structured narrative that makes meaning, gives conclusion, and makes sense of the present. And dreams do that in much the same way as genre fiction can.
It's interesting to think about character development and dreams in fiction, isn't it? And because I'm interested, and I want Jason to come in on this question as well, whether or not we are at all in control of our dreams or what we dream about. I'm one of those people, I never remember if I have dreams. Very rare should I remember a dream, and usually when I remember them, they're incredibly boring and not really worth remembering. But obviously I know a lot of people have exactly the opposite experience of that. But, you know, in a novel, if you were writing about a character's dream, you could use that as a really good device to tell us more about their character that maybe they didn't even know or recognize themselves as a character. But Jason, can we control our dreams? Can we control whether or not we remember them? Are we all having them, or do some people?
Now you've asked a beautiful question, because I get to talk about me for a change. So there is a process called lucid dreaming. And this is somebody having awareness that they're dreaming and being able to control the dreamscape. And I won't go into the reasons why I decided to do such a weird study, but we've just published a study where we took a group of people with insomnia, and we created a program to train them to lucid dream. And what we did see is that those people that managed to lucid dream both improved their insomnia and they reduced anxiety and depression. So there's clearly a relationship between the dream and emotion regulation.
Interesting. So just so I make sure I understand, lucid dreaming, is that when you are when you know you're in your dream and you are directing or participating in the dream? It's not, okay.
Knowing that you're dreaming and being able to change the scape of it.
So how on earth do you teach people to do that?
Believe it or not, it doesn't take long at all. So we created a program which is based upon some work by Stephen Lavage, which is called the MILD technique. And so it was a series of 4 half-day workshops. And it's teaching people to understand dreams, to embed in the daytime those cues to know that you're sleeping and you're dreaming at night. And so there's quite a few little techniques in there that we taught people over a period of 2 days, really.
Is lucid dreaming healthy then? I mean, I get that there are positive outcomes, but would it be best if we were all doing this all the time? Would it improve our lives or just improve our sleep?
It's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that, because the one thing that I have solace in is that when we look at the brain of somebody who's lucid dreaming, it looks exactly the same as if they were practicing mindfulness. There appears to be some metacognition So the same sort of pathways of the brain are working at both points. So possibly, potentially, the same benefits that you'll get from mindfulness and from deep meditation, you'd also get from lucid dreaming. But we don't know, because in most instances, we're not going to remember our dreams anyway. And is there a reason to forget? And that's the question we haven't answered yet.
Yes, I haven't. I'm also going to ask you about nightmares, because I'm fascinated by nightmares. And again, when you're thinking about post-apocalyptic scenarios or what fiction does really well, we love a good nightmare, don't we? Or the cultural idea of nightmares. I don't know if you were able to tell us, Jason, what the scientific reason for nightmares is, and then maybe other people could join in on how we interpret them in other places.
So based upon the majority of dreaming happens when we're in rapid eye movement sleep. And the way that you can tell whether you're in rapid eye movement sleep and having a dream compared to other type of sleep and having a dream is rapid eye movement sleep dreams tend to be much more fantastical, much more vivid and very colorful. But these are also when we have nightmares. And we're certainly seeing a lot more nightmares over the pandemic. And people are dreaming about some very odd things, you know, being chased around supermarkets by lizards and bugs and things at the moment. It seems to be quite on the cards. If we also think about what REM is there for, when we look at the process of REM, it is about emotion regulation, but it's also to extinguish memories. So it's about extinction of negative memories. So let's say you had a trauma. When you sleep at night, when you're in REM, rapid eye movement sleep, you are trying to make sense of that trauma and also to reduce the anxiety from it. And so one of the theories around nightmares is that that's just throwing that out there to try to get rid of it. And so it's almost like the dream is the rubbish bin, and we're just throwing out those horrible emotions, and they're not going to make that much sense because we interpret things very, very differently. What we see as something as a negative force, somebody else may not. Somebody might like bugs chasing them around supermarkets. So that's generally where we think nightmares are coming in.
Interesting. Ladies, any thoughts on nightmares in literary culture?
Well, if we're talking about Gothic literature, obviously the nightmare is incredibly important, right? Because the nightmare is where our unconscious visits us. But it's also a really vital place where we get plot devices, where we get hints and things. And, you know, if we think about those very famous images of the uncanny in Gothic literature, of the demon, you know, bearing over the woman in her bed, and even of something like Dracula, you know, I think Dracula really hit the headlines last Christmas with those new BBC adaptations. But the idea of the dream in Dracula is incredibly powerful. And the ability of, you know, things like the mythic creatures like the vampire to infiltrate our dreams. And the dream is a space where we deal with the threat of the other, whether that's the vampire or the threat from overseas in Dracula. And like with the pandemic, that's where we deal with the trauma, right? We're trying to rationalize the trauma, confront it in our dream, and use narrative, use meaning to make sense of it.
Very interesting. Diletta, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, just that, and I think we talked about this with Jason before, like the study of supermarkets being like the kind of place for pandemic nightmares. That again, it's something that surprisingly, if you look at this type of fiction that I was talking about, so again, Sleep Donation, which I really, really recommend, yes, the nightmare in the supermarket kind of comes up, and it's something that, you know, I mean, I would have never thought about, and so it was very interesting to actually talk about it with Jason and find out that, you know, lo and behold, actually it does seem to be like a kind of nightmare that is quite prominent. And again, what does this tell us about contemporary society? You know, why the supermarket? Again, if you want to look at it from a kind of ecological, environmental perspective, there's always that kind of, like, you know, idea about excessive consumerism and where that might take us, for instance, right? So
very interesting. It's kind of sad to think of the nation all having anxious dreams about roaming supermarkets. That's the best that we can come up with. Jason, I wanted to ask you about sleep through the ages. So my daughter will never go to bed and appears to not need much sleep at all. I know teenagers that won't get out of bed. As I've got older, I would like to sleep more than I usually manage to do. Does our need for sleep or how we sleep change over our lifetime? Or do we set off in life being the sleepers that we're probably going to be?
A bit of both, actually. There is some evidence that there's genetic predisposition to how much sleep you actually need. But we do have guidelines and they change over the lifespan. So we tend to look at recommendations around 14 to 17 hours for newborns. And yet when we get to the older adult, it's somewhere between 7 and 8. So sleep does tend to reduce in terms of the amounts that people are getting over the lifespan. The question is that something that they need to do? Is that a biological imperative? Or is it because, as we get older, for example, we're going to have more illnesses, more medications, and those things may be taking our sleep away from us, as well as the fact that we might actually be sleeping during the daytime. When it comes down to our wonderful teenagers, now, a lot of people get into this whole thing about, my goodness, they can't get them out of bed. There is actually a biological reason for this. So when we hit puberty, and I'm still waiting, when we hit puberty, what tends to happen is our biological clock tends to move backwards. So we become much more evening oriented. We also then lose all of the cues to sleep. So we don't have the yawning, the tiredness, the sore eyes. And so it's not untypical for a teenager to want to go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning. But of course, because they still need a certain amount of sleep, they are not wanting to get out of bed until 11 o'clock during the day. And of course, parents want them to go to school or college or university, and they've got those lives that they have to live. And so that's why they're quite chronically sleep deprived during that period, because they're biologically not prepared to go to bed early, and they can't socially stay in bed during the morning. So that causes us quite a lot of grief.
Very interesting. I've got one more question before I'm going to open to people in the chat. So do post questions if you've got them or queries. Why do we sleep at night? Do we have to sleep at night? Why did we decide it was that way round? Is it just to do with working in the fields?
There's a theory that it's about working in the fields. There's also the issue around, do we want to be out and about at night? It's a bit of a dangerous time because, believe it or not, of all of the animals on the planet, we've probably got one of the worst eyesights. And so seeing things coming is a little more challenging at night. And so one of the theories about why we sleep at night is, of course, so that we can have a period of rest, but also that it's the most safe for us. We can keep ourselves safe at that time.
Because I feel like I've read things about shift workers and that work either having sleep that alternates like that or just always, being awake at night is not great for us. The health outcomes aren't great for that, are they?
Certainly not. I mean, the World Health Organization does identify shift work as a carcinogenic. And so the challenge is because, we're set up biologically to do a lot of things during the night. We think it's a very passive process, and it's actually a really active process. And we have hormones that help facilitate that. Melatonin is produced when it's dark. And of course, if you then shift somebody's biological clock completely the other way, A, they're going to be trying to sleep when their physiology doesn't want them to. And B, there's an awful lot of other things that go on during the day. There's noise, there's light, there's all these other things that are competing. And so people who do shift work generally are getting less sleep than they need because they're getting disrupted. Because A, they're vulnerable because they shouldn't be trying to sleep at that time. Mm-hmm. And B, there's a lot of other social elements around it which are going to keep them awake.
Yeah. We've got a question in the chat about why is the menopause so disruptive to sleep? And this is something you hear a lot of, isn't it? It often seems to be the point in women's lives where sleep problems kick in. Is it all hormonal or are there other things going on?
It's largely hormonal, and it's because of a lot of the issues that are coming across for women going through the menopause is really the hot flashes. And it's the hot flashes that will wake you up. And it's like you can equate it to things like alcohol or a party going on next door. Some of these things that go on, and even the hot flashes, are not sufficient to necessarily wake you up, but they bring you out of deep sleep. And that can be just as harmful in the long run, because you may think that you've slept for 8 hours, but it's actually not very good sleep. So you've got the issue around quite a lot of changes in medication status around the menopause as well, which have been shown to impact on sleep as well as the menopause itself. There's some really good research actually that's just come out by Sarah Nowakowski, and she's showing that we can actually help manage women through the menopause using cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. If you
Interesting.
deepen the sleep, then those arousals don't happen.
So talk us, because I've mentioned this when I introduced you, this is something you are a specialist in, isn't it? Can you talk us through what cognitive behavioral therapy for sleep insomnia looks like, or how it might differ to CBT that we might be?
Oh yes, it differs quite considerably from what we would see as a CBT. CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, is very specific, and it's actually quite prescriptive. And so what you're doing is usually lasts for about 6 to 8 weeks, an hour sessions each week. And what you're doing in this instance is you're identifying all of those anxieties and dysfunctional beliefs, and like dysfunctional thinking around sleep. So you're debunking all the myths, and you're getting people to do that for themselves. But two of the bigger, I think, behavioral components of it, and I talked about one of them in my talk, it's called stimulus control. Leaving the bedroom if you are not asleep in bed. Because what happens if you spend that time in bed? You start to associate the bed with somewhere that's not conducive to sleep. You're also more likely to bring in a few things to help you. And so you start to derail those lines between sleep and bed. And so what we do is we tell people, okay, if you're in bed and you're not asleep, get out of the bed. It's breaking that association between no sleep and the bedroom. The final one that we talk about is a strategy called, and it's horrifyingly called, sleep restriction, and which is a complete misnomer, because can you imagine saying to somebody with insomnia, oh, I'm just going to restrict your sleep? They're more likely to hurt you. So I tend to call it sleep retraining. And what you're doing in this instance is, what we know is when you have insomnia, and again, it speaks to one of the points that I made, we compensate. And our way of compensating is, I'll go to bed early. I'll have a lie-in. I'll have a nap. What that does is it fragments sleep. Because if you think of sleep as a big block, and then suddenly you're going to bed earlier, then you're having a lie-in and a nap, you fragment sleep. You make it thinner and lighter. And so one of our strategies is to squish it back down to make it deep, thick. And this is where a lot of maths is involved. So if you're a mathematician, you'll love CBTI. But in essence, what we do is we take it back down to a core. So we almost go to its default position. So it's not dangerous, it's not harmful, but we'll then eke it out over time to give people more opportunity for sleep. We make it really, really thick. We make sure they get all of that deep, refreshing sleep they need to repair the system. And then we'll eke it out to see how much they actually need.
There's a question in the chat about carbohydrates. Do carbohydrates help sleep? And we had a question earlier which I wanted to pick up on, which was, is there any research that links food, obesity and sleep?
Oh, just a little.
So if you'd like to take on all those as one question.
Wow. Okay, let's take on the sleep and obesity, and then we'll take on food and sleep. So if we start to think about what sleep is actually there for, what it does, It helps us regulate glucose at night and our insulin regulation as well, the sensitivity of our insulin. There are two other hormones which are very strongly affected by sleep loss, and these are called leptin and ghrelin. And leptin and ghrelin really are the hormones that tell us that we are full up or that we are hungry. And what we see is that when you deprive people of sleep, and this has been done experimentally, not only do you change glucose regulation, which could, of course, in the longer term lead to things like type 2 diabetes, but you also change the dynamics of leptin and ghrelin. And so people don't feel full up and they're more hungry. Now, how does this translate? It actually doesn't, believe it or not, translate into people eating more, which you'd think it might do. But what it does do is it changes your food preferences. So you'll have a preference for fat, sugar, and carbohydrate. And these things, of course, are the things that are related to gaining weight.
Janet's saying rice pudding works for her in the chat. I guess that's making me think about that thing of having a milky drink before bed.
Oh, the milky drink before bed. So, believe it or not, the relationship between food and sleep is only just coming to the fore. And we've relied on a lot of folklore for a long time. And, you know, it's coming up to Christmas, and I'm going to be called by a news reporter any day now to say, does turkey make you go to sleep?
Or is it just your relatives?
And I will say, do you realise that you'd have to eat 2 turkeys to get enough sleep medication? I think that has more to do with the sherry than it does.
Sarah in the chat is asking about night owls and larks and whether or not CBTI could turn you from one to the other. Her partner is an owl and she thinks he might have a sleep disorder because they put off going to bed for as long as possible. Can you change who you are in that way?
Oh, God. Do you know, I love it because you're asking all of the questions where I've actually done work in the area. Handy. So there is an element of being a morning person, an owl, a lark, or an evening person, an owl. And there is a particular gene, or at least one of many genes, which does dictate to a certain degree how morning-oriented or evening-oriented you are. It's called the PER3, the period 3 VNTR. Now, the challenge with that is that it's genetically based. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it can't be changed because we have epigenetics. What we do know is that there is a natural tendency to start to move towards morningness as you get older. After around the age of 39, that gene, the influence of that gene starts to diminish somewhat, and we all start moving naturally towards morningness. Some of us will stay in the owl arena. So unfortunately, CBTI is not going to turn an owl into a lark. But hopefully, if she sticks with it, it'll happen on its own.
Oh, how very interesting. Katy, I want to ask you more about this slow lit movement. Because I think many people who read will be thinking it's the boring books that put you to sleep. Or maybe just before bed you don't read the most exciting books, otherwise you'll be turning the pages all night. Is this really a movement, or is it just bad literature?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the authors that. I think the purpose of the story is really interesting, right? Because I remember and seeing my own goddaughter and other children, they want the exciting story at night, and you leave them on the cliff edge, you know, that kind of EastEnders, dun, 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 where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you're like, next chapter, and you get tucked in and you've got to wait. And that is the absolute opposite what we need as adults, right? As adults, we do not want that at all. We want something nice and calming, or at least that's what sleep stories are suggesting. We want escape. We don't want stories about our day-to-day lives. We want resolution and conclusion. We want beautiful aesthetics. We want gorgeous soundscapes to our stories. One of the most popular sleep stories is a soundscape of rain falling on an empty road in a city. That kind of almost kind of very relaxing backdrop that could just ease you off. And it's interesting that where our days, and more than ever in lockdown, you know, we live our life in these four little walls virtually, where we see lots of faces, hear lots of voices. Sleep stories are often one single voice, very calm, very slow, telling us a single narrative without competing voices or competing stories, going from one destination to another and leaving us at the end with clear signposting in between. It's a world away from living in a global pandemic where you don't know what's going on and you don't know the rules from one minute to another. Everything is chatter and noise, multiple platforms all around you, multiple screens. This is singular, it's peaceful, it's simple, and it has a clear linear narrative arc. And it's that kind of story that is slow. It's that kind of story that is not competitive with any other source, whether it's your podcast or whether it's your phone or whether it's your TV or your iPad competing. It's just singular. And there's a certain beauty in the slow and the singular at the moment.
There's a question in the chat for both you and Diletta about whether you feel the function of sleep in literature has shifted over the centuries. Are dreams used differently by writers after Freud, for instance? Or are there other key moments of change when there have been big shifts in how sleep is used? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'll kick off a little and hand over to Diletta, because any generation of writers has this, what we call the anxiety of influence that hangs over them from the generation that went before it. And certainly if we're looking at, you know, the long shadow cast by Freud over dreaming, and the almost, I'm sure Jason will be able to comment on this, the lazy interpretation of some Freudian theory in relation to dreams by literary critics a lot of the time, and psychoanalysis in literature. And of course, I think, you know, writers write very consciously of that long shadow of influence over them. But as we've seen, and as Diletta points out in her research, that resurgence in the 21st century is certainly there for a reason as well. Diletta?
Yeah, I think, I mean, about that point about key moments of change, I think there's an interesting kind of parallel that a lot of people are tracing between, you know, literature now, and so again, this sense of a crisis, etc., but also literature around, you know, the Industrial Revolution, for instance, onwards, and that kind of, you know, modernity, the city, kind of urban life, and that as well as being essentially a moment in which insomnia becomes prevalent in literature. So you've got people like Dickens, for instance, who was famous for being an insomniac, and also had these kind of values attached to sleep, where I mean, pretty much like Edison, for instance, he thought that, you know, the fact that he wasn't sleeping was what actually was making him a great writer, basically. And so that sleeping effectively means, you know, closing off to the world, and so not being alert to what's happening around you, and so not being able to write about it. And so I think that that kind of moment, again, of the Industrial Revolution, modernity, etc., is quite an important moment for sleep and literature in that sense.
I was thinking as well about the idea of the changed states of sleep. So I'm reading a book at the moment, which is great actually, called The Shapeless Unease, which is about a year of not sleeping. And Samantha Harvey is a brilliant writer, so her description of how she feels when she's not sleeping is great. But it reminded me, and Diletta, like you were just saying, that there are states that people claim make them more productive or more creative. And we've heard this around drugs and drink, and insomnia and lack of sleep takes us to a slightly different place, doesn't it? I mean, I'm interested if there's a name for that state, or if that's true, or if it just feels different if we've not slept. But lots of people do make claims about creativity in that space, don't they? Or inventiveness. Are we in a different state, Jason, when we've not slept?
Potentially, yes. We can start talking about, and some people have framed insomnia as a dissociative state. Because if we think about it, even though we may be awake, parts of the brain which regulate things like attention, memory, perception, they still down-regulate. And so you've got a sleeping brain in an alive, awake person. And that creates quite a dissociation that can go on. And sadly, that does translate, of course, into what we see a very strong relationship between poor sleep and suicide. Because if you think about it, you're awake in the middle of the night, and it's dark, and you're usually alone, and you're not feeling great about yourself. But the additional problem you have here is that rational thought has gone to sleep, reward inhibition has gone up, and so different parts of the brain. And so you're awake in the middle of the night, it's dark, and you've lost rational thought and problem solving. So yeah, and we can start to look at some of the sleep disorders. If we talk about REM behavior disorder, so that's when you walk, talk, or make actions during the night, in the last part of the night, when you're asleep, that you're actually moving. That is REM sleep crashing into wakefulness. So it's a dissociation between the two. If you go sleepwalking, sleep talking, sleep eating, that's usually early part of sleep, non-REM, and wake crashing together. Narcolepsy is when people fall asleep inappropriately, in appropriate times and places. That's REM sleep and wakefulness crashing in the opposite direction. So we start to see that all of our sleep disorders are actually different sensory statuses where we can become dissociated.
This is so fascinating. I'm also keeping an eye on the clock, because it is my responsibility that this event doesn't go on for 5 hours. We're going to wind up soon, and I know Diletta is keen for us all to recommend books around sleep or sleep conditions. So I wanted to end by asking both our audience, go for it in the chat, let us know about any books or films that represent sleep in an interesting way. But I'd like to end by asking each of our panelists just to recommend a book that hopefully wouldn't be too stimulating, because we do want to go to sleep tonight, but would you like to give us your recommendations, please? I'll start with Diletta.
So this was actually a big hit in terms of people suggested it on Eventbrite as well, but it is one of my favorites. So I am just going to say it, and it is Tessa Moshfeg's My Year of Rest and Relaxation, because it's a very interesting book in terms of how sleep is basically seen as a kind of escape from society and things that essentially are too overbearing for the character at the moment. And there's also like an interesting kind of historical angle with 9/11 being in the kind of background of what is going on. So
I love that novel. I would second that recommendation. Katy?
Well, that was going to be my novel for last year, so I won't be prepared for this. That is absolutely my novel of the last few years. It floored me when I read it, because it's the most subtle 9/11 novel, and also from the perspective of a female narrator, which isn't very often the case in 9/11 novels. But I also had a backup, so it's okay. So this, I'm not sponsored by Calm, I've got to say, after today, but I stumbled across this book, which is The Magic of Sleep, which is a gorgeous little book because it's part workbook and it's part info. So it's kind of a collection of all of the myths and associations we have with sleep as a society. It's got little quizzes and things you can do to measure your sleep. And it's got everything from kind of what makes lullabies work, how you can learn in your sleep, down to apps and the shipping forecast, and what works getting people to sleep across the world in different cultures. So The Magic of Sleep is my little bedside companion find of the year for nonfiction.
Oh, that sounds great. Although I don't like the idea of learning in your sleep. No. Jason, any recommendations?
Well, I was going to say, Katy, you wouldn't recommend my book? Actually, the book I would recommend, if anyone wants a really nice, scientifically sound, really accessible book, it's Alice Gregory's Nodding Off. And she talks right the way through from cradle to grave about sleep need and really the science of it, but in such a beautiful way. I would recommend that one.
Brilliant. Well, 3 books to keep you going there. We'll leave the chat open for a bit if people want to. If you're busy Googling the author of the thing you can't remember, please do note it down. I wanted to mention, because I was fascinated thinking about this, and it made me remember novels I hadn't thought about for a long time. Do any of you know The House of Sleep, Jonathan Coe's novel about, I mean, that's from back in the 90s, isn't it? But it seemed to be around a number of the things we were talking about tonight. So yes, it's brilliant. So thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting. I think we need to start a sleep podcast, because I feel like there's lots to talk about here, and loads of ideas around how we sleep and why we sleep. So thank you very much for all your contributions. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you for joining in and for being so great in the chat. Oh, Nodcast. Some great recommendations in the chat. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night's sleep. Thank you and goodbye, everyone. Bye.